Well, thank you, Pam. Um, Let me spotlight myself here.
I don't know why this thing always wants me to confirm that I'm speaking in French.
We're all hearing you in English, so it's
Okay, I'm going to mute myself and everybody else.
oh, thank you, and thank you, PSWC, for inviting me this morning. Coming to you from my home studio in upstate New York, a little bit west of Albany, for those of you who are familiar with the state. So I'll be doing a portrait sketch for about the next 2 hours. Um, Feel free to unmute if you have any questions. I like to keep these things really casual, and just I'll walk you through my process, which is kind of the shortest description is I get myself into trouble and then I dig myself out of it. I like to make a bit of a mess with the pastel and then from there add some order to it so that I get some interesting marks that I can play around with. If I come in too structured, then things start to feel a little boring to me, almost like a paint by number. So, I like to just make a bit of a mess and have some fun with it. So if you give me a second to switch some cameras around here. Okay, so you should be able to see me here. The reference is here. This is a model I've worked with a few times before, mostly online. She has an Instagram presence and creates reference images for artists. And I put her name above the picture if you're interested in looking her up. So I'm working on a dark blue pastel mat. And this has been the surface I've been using probably for the past couple of years. I like the softness of it. I can really build up a lot of texture on this paper, but it still gives me the ability to soften edges nicely. I can just use my thumb and like wipe out an area to blow out an edge. Um, Prior to that, I was using UArt a lot, and to be honest, I was doing a bit of a sketch last night on UArt, and I realized how much I missed it. So I might be might be jumping back on the UArt bandwagon for a bit. So to start off, just using willow charcoal. Just to get some marks down. Um, the charcoal I prefer is Coates, Coates. Um, it's a very soft charcoal, and it's also a natural charcoal. A lot of the charcoals you get these days are made of powder that's then pressed together with some sort of binder, which is also how pastels are made. But um, I find with charcoal that tends to make them go a little blue. And this is a very natural charcoal. There's I don't know if it's showing up on the camera, but you're getting little knots in it, from the natural wood, and it's just a much warmer charcoal. So first, what I want to do is position the image on the paper, and I think I'm going to go pretty close to the reference. Um, I'm not going to really recrop it in any particular way. But this is mostly about scale. And the reason I chose this image is because the way her hair is flowing, it's a really nice framing device. So I don't want to lose sight of that while I'm planning out my composition. I find sometimes, especially with a portrait, it's like you zero in on that section of the face, and then the entire composition and rest of the piece kind of falls away. Um, so I try to save that for the last. I want to have a lot of my bigger questions answered before I really start into trying to capture a likeness or anything like that. Another thing I liked about this pose is that half the hand is hidden in the hair, so that'll make it a lot easier for a demo. If you have any questions, feel free to unmute and just shout them out. I like to keep these pretty casual. Just figuring out basic placement of features, where everything's going to come together here. And especially making sure that my big shapes are in the right proportion to each other. For example, I'm seeing that I don't have enough room here for the hair compared to the size of the hand. So if I push that out, that's tight, shortening up this space, is that shorter than I actually want. I think we're still in pretty good shape there. There's a bit of a tilt to her head, so I want to make sure that all of these features are lining up on that axis, right? The eye line, if you were to draw a line between, say, the two nostrils, the mouth line, bottom of the chin, all of these should be parallel to each other. If her hair showed her forehead, I would do the same there, but she has bangs, so that's kind of irrelevant to this one. So with a little more information on the structure of the forearm. But yeah, I really don't want to put a lot of effort into the drawing at this point. Earlier in my career, I would do these incredibly detailed and these drawings that I transfer on, and I would have solved every problem, made sure that every line was exactly where I wanted it, transfer it over, and start painting. And I'd have two problems there. First of all, I found that I got bored with them quickly, because for me, a lot of the enjoyment in doing this is the problem solving. And if I've solved all of my problems before I've even started painting, then well, it's kind of just an exercise at that point. And what I also found was that I would paint more timidly. I wouldn't make broad strokes. I wouldn't make any bold decisions because I'd put so much effort into that drawing that I didn't want to lose it. But with this approach, there's really there's no attachment to anything. If I find some shape needs to be moved, it's so easy to just move it. I don't have to consider that, I've drawn the perfect eye, but it's in the wrong spot. Do I readjust the entire head to fit that? At this point, it's just a mess of marks. When I come in with a pastel, I can kind of choose which mark I want to go with and just be free about it. Let it flow.
Corey, when you're working on you art, do you also use charcoal?
Depending on the color. If it's You know, if it's the tan, then I would. Um, but you know, on most of the time I use UART dark, in which case I'd use a pastel pencil.
Thanks.
Sure. And the color of the pastel, usually I try to go with something that's going to be within the general range of the piece, but not necessarily something that I'm going to replicate, so that those lines show through, that they add a little extra dimension to it. For example, you know what? Like I mentioned, I started one last night, and it's right here. So this is just a little figure sketch I was working on. And you can probably see a little bit in here. There's some hot pink in the hip and a little bit in the chest here. And that's that magenta pink was the color that I used to map out the piece. So, you know, letting it show through in a couple little spots, I feel like helps harmonize the piece, and it gives me some interesting marks to play around with. Little adjustment to the nose was a little long, and it's also a something I have a tendency to do. And I find it helps to be aware of those spots where you just have a tendency to see it incorrectly. For me, I always make noses too long and I make hair too tall. I blame the hair being too tall and growing up in the 80s. But you know, knowing that I have these tendencies uh, to missee areas, I try to be more conscious of that. And you know, just when I'm reassessing an area, one of the first things I ask myself is the nose too long? Is the hair too tall? No
So
details at
Corey,
all, though. Yep, go for it.
oh, yeah, I think well, you're answering some of my questions as I watch you work, but seems like you're making some very bold marks with those with the charcoal, but doesn't seem like you're worried that it's going to show through or it comes it erases fairly easily. I guess it's dependent on the paper too, but yeah, I was surprised to see the bold marks there.
Yeah, it's dependent on the paper. It's also dependent on the palette. You know, since this has such a dark background in the reference image, and you know, I'm probably going to come in with a dark and block all that out. You know, a lot of the darkness of the charcoal doesn't matter. Um, and also right before I come in with the pastel, I'm just going to take a paper towel and knock some of the excess charcoal off, just so it doesn't muddy up some of my colors.
Got it. Thanks.
That's good enough. So first, I like to start with my shadows. Um, and I like to state all of the shadows in the piece using the same color, at least in the beginning. That'll help unify the entire piece, kind of sets the tone for the color palette you're going to use. I'm going to use a dark reddish brown. This happens to be a Unison BE6. Unison has started making these very large pastels, and I'm a big fan of them. The texture is slightly different. they're a little bit harder. But I like that I can, go bold with my mark making. If I take the paper off, I have almost a 3-inch brush really. But that's not what I'm doing on this one. I'm just really scribbling in those darks, trying to get a sense of the volume of the piece at this point. All of this is first layer, everything will be covered up eventually. So, I'm not concerned about any of it yet. Her rib cage is all in shadow. I'm not seeing it quite as dark as I'm putting it down, but I think compositionally that'll work a little better. And especially once I put in, a real dark for the background, that will appear a lot lighter.
Corey, what color did you say that unison was?
That is a BE6.
Thank you.
Sure. And so now want to block in the flesh tones. This is a BE22. And this is another thing I've noticed with these large unisons is, how different they're the same line of pastel, but you can see how much larger this one is. So I guess sometimes you get a deal. Blocking in all of my lights with the same color. For those of you that paint landscapes, it's the same principle as a no-tan, just it's not in black and white. It's just a 2-value. Separating my lights from my darks so that I have a strong sense of what the composition is. So the other big dark I have is just the rest of the hair, and she has this kind of blonde auburn hair. So I want something a little bit lighter than what I already had. Something that's a little bit more towards a green, because this dark is drifting towards a red. So adding something that's drifting towards a green will, there'll be subtle complements. On the shoulder. Now I just want to throw in a background tone. This is a Sennelier Giant. They only come in black and white. It was substantially larger when I bought it. But I also think it's one of the more saturated blacks that you can find in pastel. I do prefer this to say like a Terry Ludwig eggplant. While it's a nice color, it just has a little too much violet in it for my taste. Looking for some other spots that I can bring this dark in. That'll help me lose some of these edges, you know, let this hair start to kind of melt into the background. I don't want to come in too close to the face just yet because I haven't fully resolved those shapes. And while I wasn't really concerned about the charcoal influencing the colors, this most certainly will. I'm going to come in with a little bit of pink and lighten up some of these areas. This is, you know, just a regular unison. And tighten up the drawing a little bit. I already see the eye needs to go up a little. Now it's just, you know, looking for the right angles. You know, which way is the chin moving? Which way is the mandible? You know, just finding the angle on the image and trying to replicate that. Not really thinking too much about anatomy right now, and really trying to not think about defining in my head what feature I'm drawing. Because, for example, if I think in my head that I'm drawing an eye, then I'm already coming with all of these preconceived notions of what an eye should look like, and you know how it's shaped based on all of the eyes I've seen and all of the eyes I've painted. And right now, I really just want to react to the image. So, you know, I'm squinting down when I look at it, trying to just simplify everything I'm seeing and just thinking about shapes. You know, anatomy can always come in later. Once you have the shapes, then all your proportions are in line, and anatomy becomes a lot easier to figure out. You know, you'll get to this point when you're working through the anatomy where it just suddenly clicks in your head. You know, because, well, we all have the same structure, and you know, you'll just move a shape a little bit, and there's that part of your brain that'll go, but yeah, I have one of those. That's how it works. Bring in a little bit of lip color before I go too far, because you know I'm also establishing my palette here. And there won't be too many other colors that I need to bring into this. There'll be some other modulations of color, you know, as I shift values as I go through it. But you know, this isn't a very chromatic palette. Looking for some spots, you know, especially since this is such a vibrant red, it's going to instantly draw the eye. So I'm thinking about where my center of interest is, which is automatically the face, but then I have a secondary center of interest with the hand. So if I bring some of my reds right in here, that's going to keep the viewer's eye right in the most interesting part of the piece. You know, I wouldn't want to take this red and then maybe bring it down to the elbow, because that would just shoot the viewer's eye right out of your painting. And, you know, the longer you can keep them looking in the area you want them to, the longer they linger, the more attention they give your piece, and maybe they'll even buy it. Like, this is it's another unison. It's almost a forest green, kind of like a low chroma forest green. I think I'm going to like the way it works on the hair. So yeah. So I just need to, there's still some spots of blue showing that need to be filled in. Seeing a nice bit of light hitting the forearm here. And that's changing the value ever so slightly from here to here. So I want to just come in, maybe go one step lighter on the forearm, dragging the pastel across the form. That'll help give the feel of volume. Just finding a couple of these lighter spots. While I do see it lighter on this back shoulder, I'm not going to put that there because I feel like the light that I've put here has already pushed that shoulder back, and I'm getting a little more depth within the picture plane already. I don't want to put a lot of these lights in the face, but there are a couple spots that need it. Right here, as the mandible changes to the lips, it's catching light. There's a little bit on the nose too, but I think I'm going to go pinker on that. So one thing I like to do is think about some of the color bands in the human face. For example, there's a lot more blood close to the surface in the cheeks, nose, and chin. So if you go a little warmer with those, it'll feel a little more alive. Whereas in the forehead, there isn't a lot of flesh there. It's, pretty much just skin on top of bone with a little bit of muscle. So up here tends to go a little more on the yellow side. I'm not sure how much of that I'll actually be bringing in because of the way your hair sits. This Great American worked very nicely on adding that warmth to the cheeks and nose, but without skewing the value. Thinking about the eyelids, it's much the same principle as the nose and the cheeks, where there's a lot of blood right by the surface, but because the eyelids are a little bit transparent, you can see some of the capillaries in there, and it tends to go almost a little bit violet. Um, let's throw a little tone in there, and that honestly, that's probably a little too much. Um, but I can just bring that flesh tone back in and knock it back. just a little bit of the eyebrow peeking out on this far side of the nose. So I'm going to use the same color that I use for the hair in here. I want something darker, but I want to choose a color that's going to harmonize with everything I already have. I can probably use that to knock back a little bit of that violet because it just looked a little bit too much like eyeshadow. And that's not really what I'm going for. And it was totally the wrong color for her anyway. So. Can't forget eyebrows. I'm going to bring a little bit of that pink into the lips as well. Just use it as the highlight color on that bottom lip. And there's a little bit on the chin. Any questions so far?
Well, a little while back, someone asked about the unison number for the green hair highlights, and I missed that. Sorry about that.
The unison color for the which one?
When you went to the green for the hair,
Oh, right. Let's see. It's a good question. I took the label off.
sorry about that.
No, that's all right. It's around here somewhere.
Other than
It
that,
might be dark 5. Based on the one that was sitting next to it, I think it's dark 5.
okay. Other than that, people are just fascinated watching your process so far.
So from here, I'm going to come back in with the charcoal. I like to use charcoal on top of pastel a lot. I feel like I have a little more control over this, and this is where I can start to bring a little order to the chaos. So I'm going to focus mostly on the face right now. So let me bring the camera in a little closer. Some of these changes can be a little on the subtler side. You can see I have an iPad here that I'm displaying the image on. That look and focus on your end?
Yeah, that looks good.
Okay, good. All right, so I'm thinking conceptually right now about how her head is moving in space, right? So the crown of her head is tipped a bit away from me. So I'm looking up ever so slightly. And I'm really seeing that in the eyelids. I'm seeing that I'm looking up into the eye a little bit here. So I want to just capture that curve. There's a little bit of the lower lid showing. It's really just, trying to capture that shape. Using charcoal to just add a little bit of value dimension. It's not making a big change, but it is pushing that back, probably not even a full value step, but just enough so that it feels like this under part under the eyes tucking in a little bit. A little bit more real estate here on the bridge of the nose. Just trying to capture that nose shape she has. She has a great, really interesting nose to draw. And working my way down from the eye, thinking about the eye as kind of a standard now, right? So that's my basic unit of measurement. And so now I'm kind of walking down the form along her nose, knowing that I tend to make them too long. Just figuring out exactly where that nostril needs to come in. And it can help to take a vertical, right? So if I take my pastel pencil and I hold it up to the reference, so I'm going to line it up with this edge of the eye and see what it intersects with. You know, see how far the corner of the nose should be from here. I'm finding that the corner of the nose here should be just about in line with the corner of the eye. It's just a little bit past it. So to make sure that I'm getting a good vertical, I'll line it up with the edge of the paper, bring it over, and sometimes I'll close one eye, just so I get a better view of exactly where things are lining up. And that seems pretty good. You know, this wing of the nostril is coming in just ever so slightly left of the corner of the eye. That's about where I want it. So from there, I can put in the nostril itself. I'll probably warm that up in a little bit, but I just want to make sure all of my various parts are working together before I start introducing more colors. That angle of the forehead. Not really seeing the other eyebrow, but there's a little bit of darkness here that might help to imply it. You know, especially up here, there's so much under the hair that you know, I don't need to get too specific. Now, because of the up angle that we're looking at, the mouth becomes pretty complicated. You know, I can actually, let me grab something that'll show up a little better than the charcoal. So I want to break the mouth down into basic shapes that'll help me figure out the structure of it. So I know it's going to be straight here, and that I know I want this to be parallel with all of those other lines that I've drawn before. So that gives me kind of a cornerstone to work from. And that comes down into this triangle shape. I can see this other wing of the lip wraps around on this side. And it dips under the skin here. You know, that needs to come down ever so slightly, just to get that curve of the mouth. From there, there's a little bit of teeth showing. And then the bottom lip wraps around the whole thing, sticks out a little bit over here. It comes back in onto the chin. The chin wraps out from there. I can see this has gone out a little farther now that I have a little more pastel, and you know, I'm not looking at things as linearly. It's more about volume and form. So, you know, I'm seeing the mouth was a little wide. I can bring that back a little. Coming back in with the dark that I had started with to catch the shadow on that upper lip. Get rid of some of those white lines. A little bit of a shadow here under the bottom lip as well. This top lip is catching a little bit of light right on that keystone right there. So, you know, it's hardly more than a mark, but it does help to add a little more volume to the mouth, and you know, so it's not quite so so much of a cutout up here. You know, a lot of times, especially earlier in my career, I would, in an effort to simplify the mouth, I would really just turn that top lip into a silhouette, and it always felt too much like a cutout. You know, it didn't have any emotion to it. You know, it was a little too intellectual, I guess. A little too much thinking, not enough feeling. And here it's, you know, making sure all of my big shapes are still working, that nothing has drifted too far as I was you know, fleshing it all out. For some of these lighter shadows, like they're coming in under the chin, I like to go a little bit more towards orange. Feel like it adds a little more life to the shadow, you know, a little warmth to it. You know, when we start learning about art and how to render things in space, you know, you always hear that you want to go cool in the shadows. And I find for portraiture that backfires a lot. I find cool shadows look dead. And, you know, unless I'm doing a zombie drawing or something like that, it's just not what I'm going for.
Now, do you do a lot of zombie drawings, Corey?
Never intentionally, but every now and then you get one that just won't land, you know. Although the kids still every now and then do request a Batman or something like that. So, which, you know, is I taught myself how to draw from comic books when I was a kid, so that's not that bad for me. For spots that I can soften up some of this. You know, as you go through and draw each feature, they tend to get a little, like I'd mentioned earlier, where each thing becomes a conceptualized version of what it actually is. And, you know, so this became my idea of a mouth, not necessarily a response to drawing her mouth. So, you know, now I start softening things up, looking for ways I can get a little closer on the likeness. And I can also fill in that spot to the left. That's going to start throwing me off. yeah, using my left hand to get that angle, it's I have to go slow because left hand isn't good for much. But this would be a lot harder to get those lines the way I want them if I use my right. I could flip it upside down, and depending on the complexity of what I need to draw, sometimes I will. Just because sometimes lefty can't be trusted. Been bringing this Diane Townsend. Uh, it's a little more violet than the black, really to knock out some of these white lines that are still showing through. Gives me a little more control than that big Sennelier. And it also gives a nice little halo effect. And I'm not sure, it's a little subtle, so it may not be showing up on the camera. But because it's ever so slightly lighter and warmer than the black around it, it gives the air in the background a little bit of presence. Like it's not just a flat color that's been put down. There's light bouncing off the skin and filling up that space, and being caught on the air. It's something I see a lot in Rembrandt's pieces, where the light will kind of drift off of the figure, and it seems to help give the idea that there's space around them. Response where I can add a little more dimension to it, a little more freedom in the mark making. And as I brought in that dark closer to the flesh tones, now the flesh tones need to be built back into it a little. And at this point, I try not to add any new colors unless I absolutely have to. So I'm using the light tone that I put in the hair here, and just using that to modulate some of these values, go a little bit darker where I need it to. Without going out and adding another color to this. The color palette's pretty established at this point. And, sometimes if you're this far into it and you just start adding new colors, things don't harmonize anymore. And, color harmony is a big part of composition. Your composition for a strong composition, it should be able to grab somebody from across the room, and organizing your values and having all of your colors harmonize nicely will go a long way towards getting you there. And then a classic example of do as I say, not as I do, I brought in a new color. But this yellow ochre, you know, it just needed a little more vibrancy in a couple spots. Dissolve the rest of the hair around the face before I really get those finishing touches in there. But I'm already happy with the structure and the color patterning. So it's really just a matter of determining, you know, what do I want to show in such a dark palette. You know, there's a lot of opportunities to push things into the shadow, let things get a little mysterious, add that little bit of Halloween that Andrew Wyeth called it. That he had a quote that you know, every good piece has a little bit of Halloween in it. Something a little bit mysterious, maybe a little bit unusual, something that just makes it interesting, makes somebody want to keep looking at it. And I feel like it also gives the piece a little more emotional depth to just have that, you know, that added touch of mystery to it. So especially for curly hair like hers, a lot of this is going to be mark making. You know, I'm not going to try to draw really the locks that I see. I will look for some of the major highlights. Here, one coming in here. But I really want it to be more about free-form mark making and just letting it flow. Because I think it'll provide a nice contrast. You know, the face itself is pretty structured. Then the hair will be loose and gestural, which will then move back into the hand, which will be, you know, again, a little more structured, probably not as much as the face, but, you know, still structured. And then the hair over the rest of it just becomes a framing device. I'm getting dark enough here in the eye so that you can tell that it's slightly open, that, you know, you're not just seeing eyelashes. You know, little details like that go a long way towards getting some life and humanity in your portraits. One of the downsides of using a palette like this with so much dark is the dark keeps falling into my lights. So I have to commit the cardinal sin of blowing on my surface to get some of that dark dust off. But I do try to keep an air filter running in here pretty much all the time. You know, just a HEPA filter. It doesn't have to be a overly fancy air filter. but it does seem to do a good job of just pulling that excess pastel dust out of the air. Kind of an interesting edge here, the way the eyebrow is flowing into this lock of hair, and then I'm getting this lost edge from where I dragged over the highlight here. Wasn't really intentional, but I like it, so I'm gonna try not to screw it up. Brown needs to come out a little bit. Carved out. So I need to restate the nostril. I'm going to come in with this kind of orangey red. It's a lot lighter than I actually see in the photo, but there's a lot of light passing through the nostril. There's no bone, there's no cartilage here, so when the light hits it, it tends to warm up that area. And if you look at a lot of classical paintings, you'll see that many artists have gone a lot warmer on that spot than you would normally think. But compositionally speaking, the nostrils are at an awkward location. They're two dark dots right in the middle of the face. So if you can go a little lighter with them, just bring the value down a little bit or up a little bit. They aren't just these, big black voids in the middle of the face. And then just shaping it a little bit with the charcoal. Adding a little more dimension to the nose. Right now it's a single straight line, which isn't really the structure of her nose. This can be a dangerous spot to be in. Because when you have a good nose, but then you want to go a little more accurate, half the time you're going to wind up with a bad nose. But you all seem like nice people, so I don't feel bad about screwing up in front of you. So just pushing that edge up a little bit here, so there's just a little bit of a bump. Adds a little more character to it. I try to avoid those kind of generalized pinup looks. I want to look for what makes this sitter unique. And, what's the simplest way for me to communicate that? one of your darkest darks on the face is always going to be right here in the corner of the mouth. You know, it's where the skin turns over at a pretty sharp angle. So you tend to get a hard edge and a dark. You know, sometimes you can go in with a little more red, depending, you know, especially on what your lighting setup is, to warm that up.
Oui. Je suis un co. Bye, bonne journée. Ferme pas la lumière, fais juste fermer la porte, mais t'as pas besoin de m'embarrer.
A little bit lighter on that bottom lip. You know, it's catching the light. But I don't want to go too crazy, especially since she's wearing lipstick. You know, if I go too light on that, then it won't harmonize with everything else that I already have. It'll look like she only put lipstick on the top lip.
So Corey, Vicky's asking, you had mentioned in the beginning finding this model online, and she's wondering where you find legitimate models online to contract with.
You can find, there's a lot of resources. I found Stephanie on Instagram, and she has a Patreon where you can sign up, and she, you know, provides a few images a month. You can also, you know, reach out and, you know, book something private if you'd like. If you're looking for something more in person, there's a website called Model Mayhem that's a good resource. You can filter by region, you know, the type of model you're looking for, what the model does. You know, if, for example, I have a studio a few miles north of here that I share with a couple other artists. And you know, every Tuesday we have figure drawing. So occasionally we'll just go on Model Mayhem and see if we can find somebody new, you know, get some new blood. But it's helpful to know what the model's willing to model.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. But yeah, Instagram's a great resource for this. And you know, I've especially noticed post-pandemic, you know, a lot modeling for an artist was never a lucrative profession. And there seem to be fewer fine art models than there used to be. So I think, you know, going online and kind of crowdsourcing these things looks like it's going to be the way it is now. Now coming back in with the lights, just looking for little spots that need just a tad more dimension. Try to be very conservative with my highlights. You know, I really just want to get highlights on the big light facing forms, which would be, you right here around the mouth. And then just those couple forms that need to have just a tad more emphasis to them, like, here along the eyelid, so that feels a little more round, the high point on the cheekbone, the little highlight on the nose. But I find that if I go crazy with all the highlights, model tends to look wet, which either will read as greasy or sweaty. Before I move off the face, I want to put in kind of the suggestion of teeth. And this is a spot where I see a lot of artists get tripped up because in their head, they're thinking teeth are white. So they grab a white pastel, and all of a sudden, it's this glaring white mark in the middle of this dark area. You need to think about how dark that area is and how much light it's actually receiving. A good rule of thumb when painting whites of the eyes, which have a similar problem, is that the value of the whites of the eyes should be the same as the value of the flesh surrounding them. A lot of times I'll just go a little bit cooler, but try to keep that same value so that the eye feels like it's part of the flesh that's around it, and B, it doesn't feel like the whites of the eye are jutting out from the head. So for that, I'm going to try this this Merlot by Great American. And it's really just going to be probably just a single mark. I don't know if that's showing up on camera at all, but from here, it's just a little bit lighter than the surrounding flesh. And since it's cooler, it's receding, which helps to, push it back. It's just a single mark, but it sells the idea that you're seeing a little bit of her teeth without having to actually go in and draw a bunch of it. Right. So block in some of the other bits of hair. Again, keeping it loose and gestural, looking for happy accidents in those marks. I'm also seeing that in the process of drawing it, I think the head grew a little bit. So I'll probably have to extend the forearm ever so slightly, but I do have a little bit of room to do that. Luckily, she seems pretty petite, so her hands just aren't going to be that big. Similar approach to the face, just looking for spots that I can go a little darker, start to push some of this into the shadow, and then I can lose a lot of these edges. Getting the last of the blue out. A couple little details, we're seeing a little bit of her thumb here. But I'm not sure how much I want to get into that. I've found that drawing a good face and drawing a good hand take pretty much the same amount of intellectual effort. And more often than not, I can only do one or the other in a sitting. Like I said, I chose this specifically because I knew this one would be simple. But anytime I've tried to do both at the same time, one suffers. So looking at her wrist as I build up some of the light here and just trying to put some hard marks where some of these bonier parts are. Because a hard edge feels hard, sounds obvious, but it isn't always. And if I, put a hard edge on this bony outcrop, it's going to, it'll be like I mentioned in the beginning, where there's that part of your brain that goes, right, I have one of those, and it's kind of bony and hard and sticks out. Give me a second to pull the camera back because I'm working down more towards the bottom right now. Restate some of these darks that got a little lost as it developed. And also in the marks I'm making here, I'm thinking about the way this shape moves, right? I have a big diagonal here. So I want to not only help emphasize that with some of the marks that I'm making in the shadows, but I also want to look for some ways to add that elsewhere. That'll help add a little bit of rhythm to the piece. So, where else can I have these diagonals coming in? And, I have a great opportunity for one right here in the eye. And, that's a great spot to have it because that's going to be an automatic center of interest. By adding that compositional element to your de facto center of interest, it keeps your composition tight, keeps people looking where you want them to. And, where else can I find it? Great things about drawing hair is you can make up an awful lot of it. Just thinking about this diagonal, how I can replicate that over here. something I find that helps me assess things as I'm working through a piece, because I'm sure you've all noticed that while you're in the thick of it with your painting, you don't notice a lot of drawing errors and spots where things have gone awry. And the best way to deal with that I've found is wait till the next day and reassess your painting with fresh eyes. But that's not always an option. And sometimes you just want to work through the piece and get a little farther with it. So it helps to have a couple tools to help you look at it from a different perspective. So what I have directly behind my easel is a floor length mirror that helps me see the piece in reverse and from a distance. Makes it a little easier to judge, especially when you're dealing with things like drawing errors. Something will look right when you're looking at it this way, but in reverse, it's glaringly obvious that it's not correct. Another thing you can do is, take a photo with your phone. In that photo, reduce it to black and white, just to get the basic no-tan composition. There's a lot of tools available to us these days to help with that. We're finding some ways to bring a little more structure to the hair. For one, to have it melt a little bit more into the background, but because this Diane Townsend is a little bit lighter than the black I put in for the background, it does peek out ever so slightly. Just help to give it a little more structure. Using that initial flesh tone that I used in the beginning to build up a little structure on the hands, or hand as the case may be. Put out with the charcoal. Like I mentioned earlier, I really just want a suggestion of a hand here. Don't want to get too caught up in the details of it.
Corey, what's the size of this painting? Or sketch?
See, this is what's the size of the pastel matte pads? It is, 1 second. 12 by 15.5.
Thank you.
As of late, I've been doing a lot of bigger pieces. So this feels a little small for me. For the last probably, well, 5 or 6 pieces I did were at least 3 foot in one direction.
Oh, wow.
Which also means I haven't framed a lot of things recently.
So another question on size. Do you aim to do life size for your portraits or models?
It varies. You know, I think for a lot of the pieces I've been doing recently, it was really more about the surrounding environment and focusing maybe a little bit more on that than just capturing a likeness, more creating a mood or a scene. But if I'm doing something that, like for example, some of the self-portraits I've done over the years, I tend to do those at life size or even a little bit bigger. I find portraits get very interesting when they're larger than life. It kind of separates them from the reality of the situation, and they kind of take on their own. There's an epicness to them. And feels a little too light. You know, that it should be moving backwards a bit more. You know, maybe getting a little more lost in the hair. So I'm going to use that large green that I used in the hair and just kind of knock it back. Pushing the value, you know, one step darker. And then I can carve out some of those lights again, but using a slightly darker pastel. You know, maybe letting more of these softer parts just fade away. That's the inverse of the idea with the hard edge here on the bony outcropping on the wrist. You know, hard edges feel hard, soft edges feel soft. So, you know, the more I can lose definition in the hair, the more like hair it's going to feel. now that the color palette on this is settling out, hardly any of the blue is showing left. I'm seeing that there's a lot of pink here, and there really doesn't live anywhere else. So I'm gonna see if I can find an excuse to use it. Since I have it here, there's an opportunity to create like a cross diagonal, because I have the diagonal of the arm running this way, and I've found a couple spots to replicate that same angle. Now I can kind of do the same thing here on a more subtle manner, just by bringing some pinks across the hand and then hitting the shoulder as well. It's not as obvious, but yeah, a lot of times obvious isn't what you want. Rib cage needs a little bit more volume, and I think we'll need to go a little bit darker. I'm using the darks on the hair to kind of imply how the light is turning under the arm. I don't want to just draw a shadow line going diagonally here, because that's at a somewhat different angle than those other diagonals, but similar enough to where I feel like it would feel a little disruptive. Use the charcoal to push it back a value, and also just to almost as a blender. Other opportunity for a good hard edge as I transition into here. There's a lot of soft edge on the far arm, and hard edges always come forward. So if I put a hard edge right on the transition area between the two, where this arm is receding, this one's coming forward, really helps to pull it out. Once again, giving that feeling of depth. My hair gave me a nice opportunity to, push that even farther. Really give me a super soft edge there. A lot of times when I put down a mark and it's just a little bit too light for the area that I want it, just tapping on it a little bit will help push it into the paper and make it just a little bit darker. Probably also helps that my fingers are completely covered in pastels, so I'm depositing a bit of color on top of it too. Thinking about where the light's hitting some of these strands of hair. It's because we have a good amount of light hitting the shoulder here. So the hair should follow a lot of those similar rules. Give it a little more dimensionality. Now, I want to move back a little bit just because I'm getting some of these edges towards the bottom. When I'm working with things like elbows and knees, I like to think about the work of George Bridgman. He was a teacher at the, I believe it was the Art Students League, got to be 100 years ago at this point. But you can find a lot of his books in public domain now, but I'm sure Amazon would be more than happy to charge you for them too. What Bridgman would do would be to conceptualize kind of how these shapes function, almost like an architectural drawing. And things like the joints like elbows and knees, he would build up almost like boxes. And it gives you this great structural feel to them that I find feels more accurate than accurate is, if that makes any sense. Because it's the spirit of how that joint functions, as opposed to all of the tiny structural details of how it functions.
Hmm? Can you back up just a tiny bit more, Corey? We can't really see what you're doing down there.
Sure.
I mean, back the camera up a tiny bit more.
Yep. I get you. That's still in focus.
Well, the elbow's still not on screen for some reason.
No. Okay. Second.
Thank you.
Sure. At this point, really just looking for some spots that need a little more TLC. Um, for a sketch, it's in a spot that I'd definitely be content with. For a larger, if this were something that I was going to try to bring to a fuller finish, I wouldn't take it much further than this today. Because there comes a point where in trying to refine the structure and the anatomy that the mark making starts to get lost. And I find it harder to assess a lot of my mark making when I'm in the moment, right? Something that might feel kind of sloppy right now, tomorrow I might love. So I usually, for studio work, I try to find a spot where I'm happy with it and then leave it there and let it percolate for a bit. See what thoughts come to it over the next few days as I, pass through the studio and reassess it. I've killed so many pieces over the years by just trying to get a little too literal on the anatomy. It's all well and good to know these things, but you don't want it to be at the expense of the liveliness of your painting. Um, for me, the whole point of doing portraiture and figure drawing is to create a connection, between the sitter, the artist, and the viewer. It's really it's a symbiotic relationship between the three. And like most things in life, if you try too hard, it comes off like you're trying too hard. I want it to feel fresh and alive.
So typically you'd let it sit, you'd come back days later, a week later, the next day.
It varies. It honestly, it's usually about how excited I am about the piece.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes I'll come back to it the next day and I want to jump right back in. Um, Sometimes there's a larger problem that I need to think through. And for example, I did a demo for a workshop for the Pastel Painters Society of Cape Cod. And it's a larger piece, probably I don't know, 3.5 feet tall. And the portrait on it came out great. I was really happy with the portrait. But there's the way the model's seated. You know what? It's right behind me. Just give me a second. I'll put that up on the easel because it's still a problem. So the way the model's seated, her arm is extended forward onto the chair, and that's causing some foreshortening, which in the photo looks fine, but in my drawing it looks like she has a shriveled up little arm. And I've taken a couple stabs at this, and honestly, I think I need to ask the model to come in, and I'll probably just move the arm. it's this area of the arm right here, especially, as it comes out from the elbow. This mass feels pretty much accurate. The elbow's coming in, when you bring your arm flat up against your side, your elbow should come in right about the bottom of your ribs, more or less. So that feels accurate, but this is stretching forward as, her hand is coming out and kind of gripping the edge of the chair. And it just isn't reading as foreshortening. It's just reading as wrong. And one of the big, I guess, pet peeves of mine is when something is, like somebody's given a critique that says, well, this part doesn't look quite right. And they say, well, that's what it looked like in the reference. Well, who cares? Unless the reference is being, pasted right next to it, it has to look right here. And if reality didn't look right, then fix it. That's kind of the artist's job, to, at least in my opinion, to improve reality. Otherwise, we'd all just be photographers.
Yeah.
But I'll show you the face, which, that part came together very quickly, and, I was very happy with it. So that's why I can't let that arm go. I feel like this is a strong piece. It needs to be finished.
Yeah, the lighting's gorgeous.
Yeah. The theme of that workshop was dramatic light and pastel, and it's been a lot of fun to do. I'm actually doing a 3-week workshop with Scottsdale Artist School online. Oh, that's coming up, isn't it? I think that starts later this month. But that's also dramatic light and pastel. So it's a similar approach. I think it's 3-4 hour sessions. If anybody's into that kind of thing.
It needs to be dramatic light with no arms.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be dramatic portraiture in pastel from here on out. So, honestly, even just that little bit of separation where, I pulled this down, set it aside, looked at the other piece, I'm already getting a little bit of a different perspective on this. Seeing some little spots that I could adjust. It's not anything monumental, but I've got a little bit of paper that's showing through here. And that kind of now suddenly looks like scars because that blue paper is still showing through. So I'll just knock that out. Not completely, because it does add a little bit of interest to the area.
When you were doing it, when you were so close up on the face and you were doing those highlights, it looked kind of garish, the highlights on the lid and under the eye, the nose, and then that one very almost kind of sharp little line on the nose. But then once you pulled back, then all of a sudden it looked just right. It's kind of amazing, just the difference.
Yeah, and I'm part of it is probably the camera as well. It likes to bump up the contrast on things. But yeah, I mean, with this technique, a lot of it is about just letting those marks kind of congeal. a lot of my favorite pieces of art throughout the years have always been ones that seem very tightly rendered from a distance. But then the closer you get, the looser they get. And you can see it's just, you know, weaving marks together um, to give that, well, impression, for lack of a better word, of highly refined structure.
And the complexity of that angle of her face it was deceiving how complex that was until you started working on the eyelid and her mouth.
Yeah, and it's always a struggle when you're working with an angle like this because your brain has a tendency to try to straighten things out for you. And so I have to be very conscious throughout the entire process that this is the angle that I want it to push to. And, you know, especially if you're in like a life drawing situation where you have a live model who's moving a little bit and things are going to shift, especially as the model gets tired. They tend to go from a dynamic pose to something kind of solid and boring, but more comfortable for them.
More relaxed.
Yeah. So it helps to kind of get those ideas set in the beginning, so that when the model drifts, you know what you're trying to accomplish. And at that point, you're really just looking to the model for inspiration in each section, as opposed to, instruction for how you actually want to do it.
Wow. Well, we're coming up on the 2
I have a
hours.
question.
Yeah, I was going to
I have a
ask.
question concerning your comment on loose close-up and tight at distance. If you're submitting a pastel for a competition, when you take your photograph of your pastel, it's a close-up view. So how does the judge reconcile what it would look like at a distance? Maybe it looks a lot better at a distance.
Well, having judged a few myself, more often than not, they're judged online anymore. And so what the judge is seeing is, probably maybe a 2-inch version of
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And it's not until they actually click on it and zoom in that they can see the mark making. And I think that's a very good thing to keep in mind when you're trying to get a piece finished up for a competition,
Yeah.
is that you really want a composition that's going to grab the judge and make them click on it to view those details. Because if, they're going through, you know, 300-400 images,
Yes.
there tends to be a lot of triage up front of, just those ones that it doesn't move me. So that one, I just keep moving, you know, so, yeah, something to keep in mind. You want that
Okay.
that initial impact from the tiniest thumbnail.
Yeah,
Good. I never heard that.
it's as though they're seeing it from a distance the first time because they're looking at little thumbnails.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and then they zoom in.
Yeah, it's usually, just a wall of 1-inch squares of everybody's work. And it takes a long time to vet all of them and, try to give everybody a fair shake. But yeah, the more razzle dazzle you can give them up front, the more likely you are to get in.
From a distance, the thumbnails, Vivienne, it's
Yes.
it's the composition usually that catches their attention.
Okay. Thank you. That's very good clarification.
Other questions before we wrap up? This has been just fascinating and informative, and questions or comments from the group?
Hi, Corey. It's absolutely phenomenal what you did in the presentation. I was wondering on the small, like stick charcoal that you were using, after you applied the dark, thicker black one, it almost looked like you were using a chocolate. Was that still the coat's black when you went in back in?
Yeah, it was still that's really the only charcoal I'm using.
Okay. So
Um,
it looked warmer on camera for some reason.
yeah, I think it's it looks black until the black pastel is on there, and then then you see the real warmth of that charcoal, which is why I
Right.
like to use it.
All right, great. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, the only other charcoal I'll use is occasionally I'll use General's charcoal pencils. Um, and I tend to go for the harder ones. And it's really just to push pastel around, not so much to make a charcoal line, but I can make micro adjustments. And, for example, if I want to go a little harder edged here, I can just, push around some of the pastel that's already in there.
Got it. Thank you.
Lisa says, thank you. Great as usual. Gail says, thank you so much. Informative demonstration. Julie says, beautiful demo. Thank you so much for sharing a lot of helpful information in a short period of time. It was wonderful. Very,
Thank you all. Yeah, it was a lot of fun.
very informative and inspiring.
Well, I hope it inspires you to go out and tackle some portraits. They aren't always as daunting as you might think. Uh, that's as good as I can get it. They're always tough, but sometimes it's worth it.
Well, I would have to say that your short explanation of going from basically a mess and then digging yourself out of the mess is that was very accurate description. It was like, I don't know how you did that.
Uh,
But keep
yeah,
keep California in mind, Corey, if you're coming out this way. Yeah, maybe
Yep.
we'll host you over here for a workshop. That would be fabulous.
Yeah, I'd love to. I was telling Pam as we were getting set up. I lived in California till I was 6. Originally from the Modesto area. So I've been out a couple times since, but it's been at least a decade.
Time to come back.
Sounds good to me.
I think he said he discovered Stephanie on Instagram, and she also has a Patreon page, Julie.
Yep.
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 Okay.
And her Instagram handle is right above the reference image, at Stephanie herself.
Okay, and we have recorded this, and so in the next couple of days it'll be available. The link will be available if you want to revisit. And thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Thank you very much, Corey. Really appreciate it. Fabulous.
Thank you.
All right, take care, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Go paint.
Take care, all.
All right, bye-bye.